Harry Pendley is the president of the Mountain States Legal Foundation, a good ally of ours, and a great organization that stands up for property rights throughout the West. Thank you for doing what you do.
Throughout America.
And you guys take on lawsuits that others won't. So you're a legal firm.
That's right. We're a nonprofit public interest legal foundation, and only thing we do is represent clients going to court. If they can't afford an attorney and they're dealing with the government, like the federal government, we're there with them.
Talk about this case up in Boulder.
Yes.
Because it's fascinating. You've done so many different cases. This guy, tell me who we're talking about first.
We're talking Michael Whitehead, Alabama boy, came to Colorado in 1985, bought a little cabin up on 4 Mile Canyon Road. You know, that area
up in Boulder, west of Boulder, yeah.
West of Boulder, about 10 miles west of Library downtown. And it's an old mining cabin. His next door neighbor happens to be the BLM. He's a mechanic.
Bureau of Land Management, the feds.
I should make clear, yeah, the federal government, the Bureau of Land Management. Right. And the outfit had an old mining shed, probably built in about 1890, 1880, something like that, not historic in any way.
All right, so on one side of the fence is...
10 feet away.
10 feet away is... you got your client who owns a small cabin.
Yes.
And on the other side, the feds,
yes.
his very close neighbor, has this old, huge shed. Right. Well, he bought there. He knew there was a shed there. I don't see what the problem is.
The problem is in Colorado, under Colorado law, if you build something on your property, something artificial on your property, and something goes wrong and it injures your neighbor, then you, the builder of said artificial thing, are liable to your neighbor.
Well, so far you haven't said anything's gone wrong. So they're living in peace and harmony.
So far, peace and harmony.
Right.
Peace and harmony. But then we had the fires, September 2010, 169 homes destroyed all around him. Erosion issues. He calls his neighbor, the BLM, said, we got erosion issues. Let's address them. BLM people came out, all good. They addressed the erosion issues. How are we going to deal with this? And in the meantime, our client says, say, Mr. BLM, this shed, I'm a mechanical engineer, this shed looks like it's coming down. It's coming down, and we need to take a hard look at it. You need to look at it and see what we can do. Oh, by the way, I'm willing to buy that strip of land that it sits on. I'll fix it, or I'll tear it down, whatever you want. And over a 3-year period, he works with BLM office to office, person to person.
So in other words, he sees that there is this building next to his that is getting weaker by the day.
By the day.
So he wants them to either fix it or sell it to him so he can fix it.
I'll fix it.
For 3 years he's been doing.
Exactly.
All right.
All through 2011.
Unfortunately, this has a happy ending because the thing was built very well and nothing ever happened.
It has a very unhappy ending. So 2011, 2012, of course, we have the big snows in 2013, we have the big floods. But 2011, 2012, 2013, he's dealing with the feds, and finally in 2013 they go uncommunicado. They're not talking. They go
underground.
Yeah, they go underground. They're not answering the phone. Finally, we're thinking March 11 or 12, either late that night or early the next morning, the building comes tumbling down. Exactly what Michael Whitehead said was going to happen. It happened. Slammed into his building. Trees were uprooted. On his right side, that's his house. Wow. And on the left side is the ruins. And that's all cleaned up. We went out there relatively recently, but he had to clean up a lot of that. He's got a walkway there. And what happened? Trees were uprooted. Boulders came down. Concrete came down. And when the trees were uprooted, they slammed into his house, and including right into the electrical panel, set off sparks. He thought there was going to have a fire. And immediately that day, March the 12th, he calls the feds. Hey, the worst has happened. Just what I told you was going to happen. It happened. It's done. And over a 2-month period, the feds, him and Hahn, different people, and finally they write him a letter in May, and they say, it's not our shed, it's not historic, and you can clean up our mess. You have our permission.
Wait a minute. If it's not the feds' shed, because it was on their property, whose shed is it that plowed into this guy's house?
Well, it's the feds' shed.
Basically, lesson here learned. When you buy a place, make sure you have nice neighbors.
Yes.
And the feds don't seem to be nice neighbors.
the federal government is the world's worst neighbor. It absolutely is the worst neighbor. I mean, you can't imagine all the people that our client had to deal with, all the people he's trying to get a hold of, have somebody in a position of responsibility say, hey, this is a problem, we'll fix it. In fact, one of the officials at the BLM wrote to the Colorado Historical Society and said, it's not a historical structure and we need to demolish it. We need to tear it down.
And what was on government property, if they wanted to tear it down, they could have.
They could have torn it down.
I tell you what, let's just do a thought experiment for a second. Let's say the properties were switched.
Yes.
All right, and your client had the property with this shed that the engineer said it's coming down, and the BLM for several years is trying to get hold of him, but they don't.
Yes.
But your client doesn't respond.
Right.
He doesn't do anything.
Right.
Same thing happens. We'd still be in this situation, right? Because
no,
then
here's exactly
what do you mean no?
Here's exactly what would happen because it happened to one of our clients, and that is the federal government would file a complaint in federal court against him and send SWAT-clad U.S. Marshals to his house to arrest him and haul him down to the courthouse to serve him. And that's
why didn't you do that to him? Why didn't your guy serve the government?
Well,
and take him
that's
to
what
court?
we've just done.
All right.
And there's a process.
But you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that beforehand. You had to wait for the damage to happen.
Well, we had to wait for the damage to happen, absolutely, because if we were to go into federal court and say we think it's going to come down, there's no injury, there's no harm. Once it came down, then we filed the paperwork. We're required to file paperwork, to file an administrative claim, say, hey, you owe us. And the federal government once again said, hey, refer to that letter we sent you saying clean up our mess. That's where we are. And so last week on the 18th of January, we filed a lawsuit against the United States government.
Which, by the way, you're very good at. You got a good record of this stuff. But let me ask you. Let's go one more thought experiment.
Sure.
What if it was a private individual, not the BLM, that owned that land and owned that shed? Would this be different? Would it have been easier? Would your client have been able to force them to fix it before it went down? Or is it basically that this is just a neighbor-on-neighbor dispute, and being an evil conservative, you're trying to blame the federal government, and this stuff happens all the time?
It would be the same. It would be the same, but you'd be hauling your neighbor into court for doing that damage to you, and that's why we're allowed to sue the government, because there's a thing called the Federal Tort Claims Act that says if the federal government does something that in a state is a civil wrong or a tort, you can sue our employees for doing it. And that's what allows us to go into court.
Is it harder to sue? But is it harder to sue the federal government than it would be to sue your neighbor on this? Because people have bad neighbors, and they get into disputes all the time. That's one of the reasons we have property rights laws and a court system to figure this out. Is it harder to do it to the feds, or is it easier to do it to the feds?
Well, under Colorado law, if you create an artificial structure and it collapses on your neighbor, you're liable.
So the incentive process is different.
It's totally different.
In that if it was a private owner who owned that bad piece of property that's going to cause damage, he'd look at it and go, that is a liability waiting to happen, and it's going to cost me a lot more later than to fix it now. But the feds, they don't really own what they manage. I mean, they own what they manage, but it's not their own money. It's a lot easier to kick things down the road until it's much more expensive.
That's absolutely right. If I had that conversation with a neighbor, I'd walk into my house, I'd walk into my kitchen and say, honey, we got to do this. We got to take care of this. Feds aren't in that position. That guy doesn't work here anymore.
Why didn't your lazy client just set the thing on fire years ago and take? All right, bring this to people who might have other issues with this. How common is this type of interaction between BLM or federally owned lands and private landowners?
I'd like to say it rarely happens, but it happens all the time. We just wrapped up a case in Arkansas, the same sort of situation. Scots-Irish family moves to the area in 1808. The government moves in 1908 and starts to use the private property, this farm, as if it were the federal government's property. And the farmers kept saying, get off our land, get off our land. Finally, we had to go into federal court and force the government to get off our land and pay us for the damage they'd done. It happens all the time. Because like you said, John, these agencies, these employees, they're not personally liable. They're not personally responsible for the harm that they do. They're going to move down the hall. They're going to move across the country. And they're going to bucket over to the...
There's no other way to handle that, I mean, government workers aren't going to own the property personally. I have a hard time thinking you're ever going to get a law passed saying they're personally liable for the bad mistakes they make. But this type of issue happens over and over again.
Over and over and over again.
What's the solution to it? I mean, in the future, what prevents this?
Well, I think one of the things that prevents it is the federal government owning less land. We recognize the federal government, the United States government owns a third of the country, including especially here in the West.
Incredible. People want to get more information about Mountain States, they go to?
Our website, Facebook, Twitter.
Mountain States Legal Foundation. Mary,
exactly
thank you.
Right. Thank you, John.
Read me in the Denver Post. Listen for me on KHOW Radio. We'll see you next week.